Nobody bids on a drowned house, and the clerk who slid the paper across the table to me knew it, which is why he did not so much as lift his chin to see what kind of person would. I was 24 years old. I had $9 rolled into the watch pocket of a barn coat that had belonged to two strangers before me, and I had a canvas duffel and a sleeping bag in the back of a hatchback that ran on prayer and recycled oil. And the only reason I was standing in that fluorescent-lit county building on a raw March morning was that I had run clean out of lake towns whose lots did not have a sign that said no overnight. I want to start with how I got there, because where a person starts tells you why a falling down boathouse on a frozen lake could become the first thing on this earth that was ever truly mine. And if you have ever stood in a warm, bright room and watched everyone in it decide you were not worth turning a head for, then you already understand the shape of the cold I am about to lay out for you. My name is Wren Caulfield. My mother raised me alone in a series of apartments over other people's garages until the winter I was 10, when a man she trusted took the rent money and the car and most of her hope, and she never quite got any of the three back. We moved the way leaves move, pushed by whatever wind was blowing, and I learned before I was 12 how to make a home out of a corner and a duffel bag, and how to read a room the second I walked into it, and know whether I was welcome or merely tolerated. My mother died of a thing that should have been caught early, and was not, because we never had the kind of money that catches things early. And I was 16, and after that the county became my parent, and the county is a tired parent with too many children and not enough beds. I aged out at 18 into a world that had kept careful track of me for years, and then forgot my name the morning I was no longer its responsibility, and I learned standing on that curb with a trash bag of clothes that being set free and being thrown away can feel exactly the same from the inside, and only time tells you which one happened to you. The 6 years that followed blur together when you try to count them. I bussed tables in a fish house on a tourist pier until the season ended and the pier emptied, and so did my pockets. I gutted perch in a cold packing room where my hands went numb by 10 in the morning and stayed numb until I slept. For a while, I drove a delivery van for a hardware store run by an old man named Stout, who paid me a little under the table and taught me, without ever meaning to teach me anything, how a roof goes together and how a window is set, and how to mix mortar so it does not crack in a freeze. And when his heart gave out one January, he left me the hatchback and $400 and a folded note that said in his shaky block letters, "Get yourself some ground, kid." The kind nobody can put you off of. I did not know what ground meant for a person like me. I had never in my life held a paper that said a single square foot of anything belonged to me. But I had seen, in the back pages of a free shopper somebody had left in a laundromat, where the county was selling off a list of tax-forfeited parcels that nobody had paid the back taxes on in a decade or more, and that the worthless ones, the ones the county wanted gone more than it wanted money, had their minimum bids dropped all the way to $10 just to clear them off the rolls. $10. I had 9, and I found one more under the floor mat of Stout's hatchback like the car itself was rooting for me. And I drove 2.5 hours up the lakeshore with everything I owned sliding around behind me, and I walked into that county building, and I sat in the back row, and I waited. They sold the good parcels first, the way they always do, the buildable lots and the Lakeview acres, to men in clean fleece vests who knew each other and nodded across the room. They got down at last to the bottom of the list, to the parcels marked access seasonal, structure unsound, no warranty, and the clerk read out a legal description and the words former United States Lifesaving Station, boathouse and dwelling, lakefront, condemned, and the room went so quiet you could hear the radiator tick. He asked for $10. Nobody breathed, and I heard my own voice, thinner than I wanted it to be, say, "I'll take it." And a woman in the second row turned around and looked at me the way you look at a bird that has flown into a building, with a little pity and a little wish that it would go bother somebody else. And the clerk said sold without ever finding my face, and that was the entire ceremony. I gave a man at a folding table $10, which was every cent I had in this world, and he handed me a deed with a gold county seal pressed into the corner, and I walked back out into the wind off the lake with nothing in my pockets and the first piece of earth I had ever owned. And I sat in that cold car and I shook, not from the cold, from a thing I had no name for. And through the gap in the back seat, a wet black nose pushed up against the side of my neck. And that is exactly where I need to tell you about Tug. Tug had found me, which is how every good thing in my life arrived, never the other way around. He had come out from under a boat trailer in a marina parking lot the autumn before, a young Chesapeake Bay retriever with his ribs showing through a coat the color of dead marsh grass, dragging a frayed rope somebody had tied him with, and then thought better of feeding, and he had sat down 4 feet from me while I ate a gas station sandwich on a curb and looked at me with eyes the warm gold of weak tea, and I gave him the second half of the sandwich, and that was the whole of the negotiation. After that, he was mine, or I was his, and I never did get the direction of it sorted out. He was a big, dense, muscular dog built like a barrel on legs, with a short, oily, wavy coat that shed water like a slicker, webbed feet, a broad, blocky head, and a chest like the prow of a boat. And he had one gift the breed is bred for down to the bone, which is that the whole of his enormous heart lived in his nose, and once that nose decided a thing was worth finding, there was nothing under heaven that would call him off it. I did not know yet that this single stubborn gift was about to turn my entire life over and shake the change out of its pockets. I knew only that I had a deed and a dog, and not $1, and an address on the deed I had to hunt down on the atlas, and so I drove. The Gale Point Life-Saving Station sat at the end of 4 miles of unpaved shore road that got rougher and narrower until it was little more than 2 ruts running through a corridor of bare birch and black pine. And when the trees finally opened onto the lake and I saw the place for the first time, I stopped the car in the middle of the road and just looked, because even half drowned and abandoned it took the breath clean out of me. The lake lay flat and pewter gray to the edge of the world, ringed near the shore with a broken shelf of shore ice gone the blue-white of old bone, and on a low point of land that ran out into the water stood the station. A long 2-story building of weathered shiplap and cedar shingle the color of a storm cloud, with a steep red shingled roof gone soft with moss, tall narrow windows clouded over with salt and thyme, a broad covered porch facing the water, and at one end, rising above the roofline, a square wooden lookout tower with a railed widow's walk, where some surfmen 100 years gone had stood watch over. The lake for ships in trouble. The wind came off the water hard and steady and smelled of cold stone and clean ice, and below the station, half buried in drifted sand and snow, ran the long, low shape of the boathouse, a great barn-like structure of silvered planking, with a wide marine railway of iron rails running out of its waterside doors and down a stone ramp into the frozen shallows. The ramp the old lifesavers had used to launch their surfboat into the worst weather the lake could throw. when other men were running for shore. I got out of the car, and Tug poured himself over the folded seat and hit the snow running with his nose already down, swinging out across the point in a wide loping circle. And I walked down through the frozen beach grass to the porch, with the deed folded in my chapped hand, and I stood there with my hand on a door that was mine, and I cried for a little while, quietly, the way a person cries when something good happens to them after they have trained themselves out of expecting good things. And then I wiped my face on the red bandana at my throat and I got to work, because crying does not patch a roof before the next storm comes off the lake. The inside of the station was a wreck and a wonder at once. The door was swelled tight in its frame, and I had to set my shoulder against it and shove. And when it gave, I stumbled into a long, high room thick with the smell of dust and lake damp and old tarred rope, with a wide plank floor scrubbed into soft hollows by a century of boots, a cold iron stove squatting in the middle with its pipe gone red with rust, a long mess table bolted to the floor, and a wall of empty bunk frames where the crew had slept in their clothes, waiting for the bell. Bolted high on the wall was a great brass bell green with age, and a board beside it painted with faded watch rotations and the names of men long dead, and I put my hand flat against the cold brass of that bell and felt the whole weight of all the years the place had stood out on that point, watching the water, dragging the half-drowned in out of the surf, while I had spent my own years being carried nowhere by nobody. That first night, I slept on the floor in my sleeping bag, with a small fire of scrap lath going in the iron stove, and Tug pressed the length of my spine, and the wind walking the widow's walk over my head. And I had slept in 100 places by then, and not a single one of them had ever felt the way that one did, like the building itself had been holding one long breath for 50 years, and finally, the moment I lay down inside it, let the breath out. In the morning, the cold was a bright, hard thing, and the lake was breathing fog, and I started the long, slow work of learning what I had bought. I had no money for materials, so I made do with what the place gave up. And what it gave up was the patient schooling of my own two hands. I learned to true a window sash and reset the wavy old glass, and to split cedar shakes off a bolt of wood with a rusted froe I found hanging in the boathouse. I cleaned a half-century of birds' nests out of the stovepipe and got the stove drawing clean and hot. And I scrubbed the salt haze off the windows until the gray lake light came pouring back in. And every single day the station gave up one more small thing some surfmen had left. A tin cup, a knife worn thin on 100 whetstones, and every one of them felt less like junk and more like a hand reaching out of the past to shake mine. I lived on oatmeal and dried beans and lake water boiled on the stove, and my hands split and bled in the dry cold, and I wrapped them in torn strips of bandana and kept on. And I want you to understand that I was happy, truly happy, maybe for the first time in my whole life, because every shake I split and every nail I drove was going into a thing that was mine and could not be taken away from me. Or so I let myself believe, and that belief was the warmest thing I owned that frozen March. I made small, ordinary discoveries every day, the kind a place gives up to anybody patient enough to clean it slow, and each one taught me a little more about the lives that had been lived there before mine. In a sea chest at the foot of a bunk, I found a folded chart of the lake, with the shoals marked in red and the wrecks named in a spidery hand, and a station logbook bound in canvas, and I read those entries by firelight the way you read a letter written to you. Wind northeast gale, vessel ashore the point, all hands saved, too lost. The patient, terrible bookkeeping of men who measured their days in souls pulled from the water. I found a keeper's name written in the front of a worn Bible in ink, gone the brown of old blood, Ezra Vane, and his year of birth, and nothing under it. No death, no wife, no child, just the one name standing alone on the page. And I sat with that Bible a long while by the fire, because a man who writes his own name alone on a page with no one to write beneath it is a man I understood right down in my bones. I scrubbed and I mended and I learned the place, and all the while the lake lay outside the clearing windows, gray and patient and without end, and I began to feel a thing I could never have explained to a living soul, that the Gale Point station had been waiting not just for somebody, but for somebody like me, somebody who knew in her body what it was to be left out on a point in the cold and forgotten. The first person who told me what I had was the one who came out to tell me it was worthless. His name was Royal Skaggs, and he ran the only salvage and scrap operation for 40 miles, and he came rattling up the shore road in a rusted flatbed about a week in, having heard at the bait shop that some girl had bought the old Lifesaving station. And he stood in my doorway, with his thumbs hooked in his belt and a toothpick rolling in the corner of his mouth, and looked the whole place over with his little wet, shrewd eyes the way a gull looks at something it has not decided is dead. He told me, friendly as a slammed door, that I had been swindled, that the building was condemned ground and the sills were punk, and the timber wasn't worth the cost of hauling, and the lake would take the boathouse inside 5 winters, and that out of the pure goodness of his heart, he would take the whole headache off my hands for $300 cash that very day. And I could drive off clean with money in my pocket instead of owning a liability the county had dumped on a girl too green to know better. $300. To a girl with no dollars at all, $300 sounded like the keys to the whole world. And I will be honest with you, I stood in that doorway and I felt the old pull. The pull a poor person feels their whole life. The pull toward the sure small thing. The deal that lets you stop hoping so hard that the hope can turn around and cut you. And then Tug, who had been lying by the cold stove with his chin on his paws, stood up and put himself between me and Royal Skaggs, with the hair standing up all down his spine and a sound coming low out of his deep chest, and Royal took a half step back off my threshold. Because a Chesapeake gone still and hard in front of you is a thing that makes a man reconsider, and I looked down at my dog standing his ground for me. And somewhere in watching him, I found my own ground to stand on, and I told Royal Skaggs that the station was not for sale at any price. He laughed an ugly little laugh and told me I would be down at the bait shop inside a month begging him to make that offer again. And he rattled off up the ruts, and I did not know, could not have known, that I had just refused $300 for a thing worth more than every dollar that had ever passed through Royal Skaggs's grasping hands in his whole life. The discovery, when it finally came because of the dog, and I need you to understand all the way down that I would never have found it on my own, not in 100 years of living there, because I am a careful person and a practical one. And a poor person learns not to go knocking holes in walls she might have to pay to fix. And the thing was hidden so well, so deliberately, behind so much weathered, ordinary plank, that no human eye that ever lived would have caught it. But Tug was not a human eye. Tug was a nose with a dog built on behind it, and what no person could see, he could smell clean through a wall. It started slow, the way these things do. For 3 days he had been wrong about the boathouse, He would not go into it willing, and when I made him come, he would not settle. And over, he went to the back wall of it, the long landward wall that was dug partway into the rise of the dune behind, and he pressed his broad nose flat to the bottom seam where the planking met the floor and snuffed along it the length of the wall. And then he sat back and stared at me. And then he got up and did the whole thing over again. The boathouse itself was a marvel, a tall barn of a room built to shelter the surf boat and the beach cart and the breeches buoy and the long heavy coils of rope, and it sheltered them still. The boat carriage standing on the iron rails of the marine railway, the great reel of weathered line, the cannon like Lyle gun the crew had used to fire a lifeline out to a foundering ship, all of it furred gray with dust and salt. I spent days in that boathouse just understanding it, freeing the seized wheels of the launching carriage, working the rusted windlass that drew the boat back up the ramp until it groaned and screamed, and the whole time Togue would not leave that back wall be. I told myself a mink had denned up in the wall, because a Chesapeake on the scent of something living is the most single-minded creature the good Lord ever shaped, and I told myself the dog was only being a dog. But he was not only being a dog. I told him to leave it, and he could not leave it, and on the fourth morning I came into the boathouse, out of the gray dawn, to find him up on his hind legs, with both forepaws braced flat against that landward wall, his broad head thrown back, baying a deep rolling boom of a voice I had never once heard out of him, rolling out across the frozen lake so that I heard it from inside the station and came running, sure he had fallen through the rotted ramp and into the water. He had not fallen anywhere. He was certain. And then he dropped down onto all fours and started to dig, not at the floor, but at the very base of that wall. Frantic, packed sand and broken bits of old plank flying back between his hind legs, and a high, keening cry coming out of him that I had never heard. And I grabbed his collar to haul him off, and he swung his head around and looked at me with those gold eyes and would not come. And I am not a fanciful woman, but I would swear to you on Stout's grave that the look in my dog's eyes said, open it, it is in there." And I let go of his collar, and I took down the heavy pry bar from its pegs, and I turned, and I really looked at that long, weathered ordinary wall for the first time, and I saw the thing I had walked straight past 100 times. The wall was wrong. The whole boathouse was old-growth pine and oak, hand-framed. Every other wall open studs you could see daylight between. But this one wall, the landward wall, was sawn fir, newer, and it was lath and plaster behind the planking, where every other wall was bare bones. And it stood a good 2 feet proud of where it should have, which meant there were 2 feet of space behind it that had no business existing. 2 feet of nothing, tucked between a false wall and the true outer wall of a building dug back into a dune. I set the flat of the bar into the bottom seam where Tug had been tearing at it, and I leaned my whole weight on it, and the old fir cried out and gave, and a long, ragged curl of plaster and lath broke away, and out of the black gap behind it came a breath of air, cool and bone-dry and dead still, air that had not stirred in longer than I had been alive, and it smelled of stone and cold tallow and dust, and underneath all of it something rich and oiled and faintly sweet. The smell of old varnish and seasoned wood, and Tug shoved his whole head into the gap and went rigid and dead silent, and I knelt down on the cold sand beside my dog and put my eye to the hole in the wall, and I could see nothing at all but black, And so I fetched the lantern and came back, and I tore that false wall down board by board with my bare hands and the pry bar until the hole gaped, wide enough to climb through, and I lifted the lantern up into the dark on the far side, and the whole world I thought I had finally understood rolled over and showed me its other face. Behind the false wall was a room that had been dug back into the dune and lined and floored with great squared blocks of cut limestone, a long, low vaulted chamber the size of 2 boat stalls, dry as flour, the stone weeping no water at all, because some long-dead keeper had laid his stone and run his drainage with the patient care of a man building a vault for a thing he meant to outlast him by a century. And down the middle of that hidden stone room, raised up off the flagstone on heavy oak blocks, sat a long, low shape, under a great sailcloth tarp gone the gray-green of weathered canvas. A shape with the sweet rising sweep of a hull showing under the cloth. A shape that did not belong in a boathouse on a forgotten point of a freshwater lake. A shape that sent my heart climbing up into my throat before my mind had even formed a word for what my eyes were taking in. I climbed through into the dry cold of that room, and my own breath came back loud at me off the stone, and Tug pressed shivering against my leg, and I reached out one chapped and bleeding hand and took hold of the corner of that ancient sailcloth, and I drew it back slow, and the oiled canvas slid off in one long hushing whisper and pooled on the flagstone. And the lantern light broke across long, deep, curving flanks of varnished mahogany planking laid plank on plank, dulled under 50 years of dust but whole, on a low knife of a hull built to part the water like a thrown blade, on bright work gone soft and amber under its patina, on a wide cockpit of cracked red leather and a wheel of varnished wood and spokes, on a long forward deck inlaid with thin lines of pale holly, on a teardrop stern lettered in gold leaf gone dull, and I stood in that hidden room holding a lantern over the most beautiful object I had ever in my life stood next to. A long wooden racing boat some craftsman had drawn by hand and built one perfect joint at a time, and I forgot how to breathe, and I did not know what it was. Not yet. I only knew that it had been waiting in the dark behind a false wall on a frozen lake longer than I had been alive, waiting, it seemed to me, for exactly one person, and that the one person had turned out to be me. I want to tell you that I understood in that moment that my whole life had just turned, but the truth is, I understood nothing at all. The size of it was too big to fit inside my skull, and what I felt was not joy, not yet. It was a kind of swaying vertigo, the way you feel when a floor you trusted shifts an inch under your boots, and I sat down on the cold stone with my back against the curve of that mahogany hull, and Tug climbed half into my lap, shaking all over, and I put both arms around my soaking wet scent-mad miracle of a dog, and I laughed and I cried at the same time in the dark, and after a while I made myself stand up and look closer, and that is when I found the rest of it. Set along a low stone shelf cut into the inner wall, where the lantern light had not yet reached, were the other things the keeper had hidden, and I went down the length of that shelf, touching each one with a single finger, as if it might dissolve at a harder touch. There was a strong box of riveted black iron, banded and heavy as an anchor, and when I worked the lid up off it, the box was packed with canvas sacks gone soft with rot, and inside the sacks were coins, gold coins, more gold than I had ever let myself imagine could sit in one place on this earth, dull and heavy and warm looking under the lantern, and beside the sacks a slim leather folio of folded papers, engraved certificates, and great old banknotes, the kind of paper That means a fortune to people who understand paper, which I did not then. There was a cracked oxblood ledger, and when I opened it, the pages held a whole life written out in a fine, slanting hand. Every wreck the station had run, every soul saved and every soul lost, every dollar of bounty and salvage the crew had been paid, going back decade on decade. The patient arithmetic of men who made their bread out of other men's worst nights. There was a small fitted case of brass instruments, a sextant and dividers, and a chronometer, gone still, dulled green at the edges. And at the very end of the shelf, propped upright against the cold stone, was a single sealed letter, the paper gone the brown of weak tea, and across the face of it, in that same fine slanting hand, 3 words stood inked, and the words were "Keep them coming." And I stood in that hidden room with that letter in my split and bleeding hands, and the tears ran straight down my face and dripped off my chin and starred dark on the dust of the flagstone, because I understood those 3 words even before I knew who had written them or who they were for. I understood that some man a long time gone had hidden the most precious things he owned in the dry stone behind his life-saving station and laid a letter on top of them, and that the letter was not about the gold at all. The letter was about the rescue, about keeping the watch, about going out into the worst of it after the ones who could not save themselves, and I felt, standing there in the lantern light, that the letter had been waiting all those years for exactly the kind of person I was. A person the world had looked over and written down as nobody. A person hunting for one cold point of dry ground to stand on. I did not sleep that night either. I sat up in front of the iron stove with the letter and the ledger and one single gold coin in my lap, turning them over and over, and Tug lay with his blocky chin across my boot, and I tried to make a plan. And the plan I made was the plan a poor person always makes, which is tell nobody, change nothing, move careful, because when you have spent your life with nothing you know in your spine that the whole world is a hand that wants to take, and I had just learned one more time that I had found a thing that men would take off me if I gave them the smallest opening. But I also knew that I did not understand what I had, and that not understanding it was its own kind of danger, and that I needed somebody who knew old boats and old paper and old things, somebody honest, and that finding an honest expert when you are a broke girl sitting on a fortune is like trying to dip a clean cup out of a muddy lake. It took me the better part of 2 weeks and most of the gas in Stout's hatchback to find Marlowe Finch. She was a retired marine surveyor and a maritime museum archivist, 67 years old, who lived alone up the shore in a cottage walled with books and half-models of ships, with a jeweler's loop on a black cord around her neck. And the woman at the County Historical Society had given me her name in a low, careful voice as the one person within 100 miles who knew antique wooden boats and old money both and could not be bought with either. And when I drove up to her cottage and stood on her step with my heart slamming and asked could she please come out to the point and look at something I did not have the words to explain, she studied me a long moment over the tops of her glasses, my cracked hands, my second-hand coat, my dog watching her steady from the back of the car. And something in my face must have told her this was not a fever, because she went and got her coat. She did not believe me on the drive out. She was gentle about it, but I could hear the worn patience underneath, the patience of an expert who has been hauled out 100 times to look at 100 things some hopeful soul was dead sure was treasure, and which turned out, every single time, to be a shed full of rusted junk. She asked me soft questions. What had I found, and where, and I could not make the words come out sounding like anything but a dream a feverish person has. A boat behind a wall in a boathouse, gold in an iron box, and she nodded and said, "Well, let us go and have a look," in the voice a person uses on a child. And I let her keep her doubt, because I knew already that it would not live through what was waiting on the point. We came down the shore road in the low gold of the late afternoon, and she went quiet at the very sight of the station, because she knew what it was the instant the tower came up over the trees, knew it was a life-saving station of a kind that had not crewed a boat in 80 years, and she walked through the long room touching the brass bell and the watchboard with a researcher's look growing on her face, the doubt draining slowly out of it. And then I led her into the boathouse and over to the ragged hole I had torn in the false wall, and I put the lantern in her hand, and I said, "It is in there." And Marlowe Finch, 67 years old, got down on her knees on the cold sand in her good wool coat and climbed through the hole in the wall, and I heard her stop dead on the other side. And I heard her go absolutely silent. And then I heard her say one word in a voice with all the worn professional patience burned clean out of it. And the word was no. Just that one word. No, the way a person says it when the world has reached down and handed them the one thing they decided a lifetime ago they would never live to lay eyes on. I climbed through after her. She was standing at the bow of the boat with the lantern lifted high, and her free hand pressed flat over her own heart and her glasses gone to fog, and she could not pull her eyes off the hull, and she drew a pair of white cotton gloves from her coat pocket and worked them on over hands that were shaking, and she walked the whole long length of that boat slow. The way you walk around a thing you are half afraid is going to wake up and look back at you. And she crouched at the stern and read the dulled gold lettering through her loop and made a sound like she had taken a blow to the chest. And then she straightened up and put her back to the cold stone wall and slid down it until she was sitting on the flagstone. And she laughed, a high, cracked, broken laugh. And she said, "Do you have any idea, child? Do you have the first idea on this earth what you are standing next to?" I said no. I said I truly did not. And Marlowe Finch, sitting on the floor of a hidden room she had crawled into on her hands and knees, told me. She told me the boat was a hand-built racing runabout, laid down in 1931 in the last and greatest years of the wooden boat, when these long mahogany knives were built one perfect joint at a time, by men who were artists with a plane and a steam box, that this exact boat had been built for a man of enormous wealth to run the fastest mile ever clocked on fresh water, that only 2 or 3 of this builder's hand were ever made, and that every one of them was believed lost, burned in a boathouse fire, broken up for the war, sunk in a storm with all the records gone down with it. She told me the collectors and the museums of the world kept a list of the famous lost boats, the way other people keep a list of saints, and that this boat was not on the list of the ones that survived, it was on the list of the ones believed destroyed and mourned. A boat the experts had written off as gone forever the year before the war, that had instead somehow traveled half a continent and come to rest in the dry limestone behind a life-saving station. Perfect, unrestored, original, complete, down to the cracked red leather and the gold leaf and the builder's brass tools laid in their fitted case. She told me, very quietly, sitting there on that stone floor, that the last known boat of this builder's hand to come up for sale had crossed an auction block a few years back for a sum that made her make me sit down on the flagstone before she would say it, and that an unknown one, a ghost, with a discovery like this wrapped around it, would not go for a penny less and might well go for a great deal more, and that the number she was talking about was millions of dollars, and she laid the words millions of dollars down slow and careful in the lantern light, the way you set down something fragile in front of a girl you are afraid is not going to survive the hearing of it. And I want to tell you what I did when those words landed on me. And the honest truth is that I did not do one single thing. I only sat there on the cold limestone with my arm around my dog and looked at the most beautiful object in the whole world. And I did not feel rich. I felt seen. I felt as if the lake itself had decided, after 24 years, to stop leaving me on the shore and to finally carry me somewhere. We were a long time in that room. Marlowe went over every inch of it, the iron strongbox and the gold, which she said was a fortune all on its own, separate and apart from the boat, that the coins were old American gold of a real value far beyond the weight of the metal, and the folio of paper, which she said were bearer bonds and great old banknotes that it would take a specialist to put a number on, but which were not nothing, not by a long mile. And then she found the letter where I had set it back on the shelf, the keep them coming letter, and she read it slow through her loupe, and she read the canvas-bound logbook by lantern light page after page, and slowly, sitting there on the flagstone, Marlowe Finch, the archivist, pieced together the story of the man who had hidden all of it, the man whose whole patient, terrible life was written out in that log, the keeper named Ezra Vane, who had run the Gale Point station for 40 years, who had no wife and no child that any record showed, who had, the log hinted and the letter confirmed, come into the boat and the gold late in his long life, by way of a man he had pulled half dead out of the surf one black November night in the years before the war, a wealthy man whose grand mahogany racing boat had been swamped and driven ashore on the point in a gale that had no business being out in, a man whose family had drowned in the cold water around him while he lived, and who could not in his grief bear to keep the boat that had cost him everything, nor sell it and turn his loss into another man's pleasure, and who had begged the old keeper Ezra Vane to take the boat and the strongbox and hide them and never speak of them, and Ezra Vane had taken the man's boat and his gold and asked him nothing, and hidden them in the dry stone behind his station, and gone on, standing his watch over that water for the rest of his days, as if nothing had changed. A rich man in secret living poor on the lake he had given his life to, and when the new automated light went up the shore and killed his station and the road grew over and the world forgot Gale Point entirely, old Ezra Vane had walled up the chamber and laid the letter on top of the gold and inked the 3 words keep them coming, the them being the souls in the water, the ones still out there in every gale yet to come. And he had died alone in the station where I now slept, having left the most valuable things in that whole county sealed up in the dark for whoever might come after to find. And whoever came after had turned out to be a girl the world had thrown out, with the trash and a half-drowned retriever out from under a boat trailer. And I sat in that stone room and I understood all the way down that I had not stolen a thing and I had not won a lottery. I had been left something, on purpose, by a man who knew in his own bones what it cost to go out into the cold dark after the ones who could not save themselves. The months that came after were not simple, because a fortune is never a simple thing, and a fortune found by a poor person is a fortune the world comes hunting for with both hands open. Word got out, the way word always does, and the shore road that had not seen 3 trucks in a week began to see 30, and there were men in clean-pressed suits who wanted to buy the boat for a sliver of its worth before I had any idea what its worth was. Men who smiled wide and called me young lady and named figures that sounded like the moon and were robbery in daylight. And there was a lawyer the county sent out who suggested, very smooth and kind, that the find might rightly belong to the county and not to me at all, that perhaps I had best sign a paper just to be safe. And there was Royal Skaggs, who came rattling back up that shore road in his flatbed the very day after the news broke, his face dark as the lake before a squall, to stand in my yard and tell me that he had a signed agreement, that I had given him my word to sell him the place, that he had witnesses down at the bait shop who would swear to it, and I was afraid standing there, the old bottomless fear of the poor. The iron certainty that this good thing was about to be taken from me the exact way every good thing in my life had always been taken. The certainty that people like me simply do not get to keep things, that the keeping is for other people, the clean-handed people, the people the rooms turn their heads for. But Marlowe Finch would not let it be taken. She knew people, honest people, the way an old archivist who has spent her whole life sorting the true stories from the false ones comes to know exactly who is which. And she brought a lawyer who took the case for the love of an old building and an old story, and not for the money in it. And we proved my title clean and whole. The deed with the Gold County seal that I had bought for $10 and that the county had sold me free and clear, with no warranty and no reservation of any kind, which meant in plain and simple law that everything standing on that point and buried under it and walled up behind every plank of it was mine in full. The boat and the gold and the paper and the old keeper's whole hidden life. And Royal Skaggs's signed agreement turned out to be a thing he had typed up himself, with a forged date in his own crabbed hand. And when that came to the light of day, it was Royal Skaggs who stood sweating in front of a judge, and not me. And the last I ever saw of him, he was standing small and slack in my yard, watching a museum's own flatbed hauler ease that long mahogany boat up onto its bed, under a clean new tarp to carry it away to be authenticated. And the look on his face was the look of a man who had stood in a doorway and called a treasure rotten and offered a starving girl $300 for it. And I did not gloat. I just stood on my own porch with my hand resting on my dog's broad wet head and watched him watch it go. Because the truest answer to a man like Royal Skaggs is to simply, quietly, turn out to have been right all along. The boat was real. The experts came from across the country and across the water to see it. Men and women who had spent their whole lives among the great wooden boats of the world. And they confirmed every word she had said and more besides, that it was the lost ghost of its kind, that its discovery in the dry stone behind an American life-saving station was the find of a generation, and that the chain of how it came to be there, a drowning man pulled from a gale by a lonely keeper and begging him to hide away the beautiful, ruinous thing that had cost him his whole family, was a story the collectors would be telling one another for the next 100 years. And when the boat went to auction the following autumn, it did not sell for the millions Marlowe had first named me. It sold for more, a good deal more. A number I still will not say out loud, because it does not feel like it could belong to a girl who once learned to pack her entire life into a duffel bag in under 4 minutes. And the gold sold separate, and the paper sold separate. And even old Ezra Vane's ledger and his brass sextant went to a maritime museum that paid me for the honor of telling his story. And I want to be straight with you about the money, because the money is the part everybody leans in to hear and the part that has always mattered the least. The money did not change one thing about who I was. It changed only what I was able to do. I did not buy a mansion or a fast boat, not after standing alone in a stone room beside the only boat that was ever going to mean anything to me. What I did was keep the watch. I took the money and I poured it back into the Gale Point station, and I had every sill and timber made sound by men I could at long last afford to pay. And I reshingled the steep roof in red cedar the old way, and rebuilt the porch and the tower and the railed widow's walk, and I cleaned and freed and oiled the marine railway until the launching carriage rolled down the iron rails smooth as a whisper, and I had the old surfboat itself found rotting under a tarp in the loft, rebuilt true to her lines by a boatwright who put his hand flat on her keel and went quiet for a long minute when he understood what he was being asked to save. And on a bright, cold morning the following autumn, with Marlowe Finch standing beside me, and Tug booming at the gulls, and a small crowd come up the mended shore road to see it, I launched the Gale Point surfboat into the cold lake for the first time in 80 years, and I did not charge a soul a dime, because the rescue was never about the bounty. The letter had told me that in 3 words, the watch was about going out after the ones who could not get themselves to shore. And that is what I do now. I live in the station that I bought for $10 and own free and clear, with my dog who found the wall, and I run a small museum on the point, and a volunteer water rescue crew that trains young people the county has given up on, the thrown-away ones, the ones the rooms do not turn their heads for, and I teach them to read the water and pull a strangling weight up out of the cold. And I keep a room where the story of Ezra Vane is told to anyone who walks up the shore road, the keeper who pulled a broken stranger out of a November gale and asked him nothing, and hid a fortune in the dark, and lived out his days poor and content beside the lake he had given his life to. And there is a brass plaque beside the swept and lamplit stone chamber I leave open now for visitors. And the plaque carries 3 words on it: keep them coming. And I have a place now, a real one, a true cold point of dry ground, the kind Stout told me with his last failing breath to go and find, and I stand my watch on it every single day. People ask me, the ones who come up the road and hear the story and look at me the way you look at a person things simply happen to, whether I ever lie awake thinking how close I came to missing all of it, how close I came to taking Royal Skaggs's $300, to never once tearing down that wall, and I always tell them the same thing, that I did not find the treasure, that a careful, practical girl like the one I was would have lived and died in that station and never knocked a single hole in a single wall, that the treasure was found by a half-starved retriever out from under a boat trailer, a dog who could smell clean through 50 years of plaster what no living person could ever have seen, and that the whole lesson of the Gale Point Lifesaving Station is not that there is gold walled up behind the plank. The lesson is that you have got to be the kind of soul, or be lucky enough to be loved by the kind of dog, who will not be called off a thing that does not feel right, who will rear up on his hind legs and bay at a wall that every other living creature walks straight past, who will dig at the seam in the dark until the dust gives up its long-held breath. And then I take them down to the water and I run them out onto the cold gray lake in the old surfboat, for free, the way Ezra Vane would have had it. And Tug rides up in the bow with his blocky head into the wind and his webbed feet braced on the thwart and his nose drinking the whole lake in, the king of every wave from the point to the far edge of the world. And I lean on the long oars and feel the weight of the water and the weight of all the years come up through my arms, And I think about a girl with $9 and a duffel bag who walked into a cold county building on a raw March morning because she had nowhere else on earth to be, and who said, "I'll take it," in a voice too small for the room, and who drove 2.5 hours up a frozen lakeshore to stand on the first piece of ground that was ever hers. And I think, every single time the boat lifts on the swell and the people in it go quiet at the bigness of the water, that the lake finally carried me somewhere after all, and that the somewhere it carried me was here, and that here is enough. Here is more than enough. Here is everything I never once let myself hope for, kept safe in the dark all those long years behind a wall, waiting for a nose that would not quit, and a girl who finally found her ground.